To the very limit. After all, as we all know, it's always the other drivers who are being inconsiderate. You can scarcely imagine how they pass their driving test. As it happens, that test is being revised next week. You now have to be able to park alongside the curb, and if you fail, your examiner can tell you why. Big deal, you might say. Doesn't the test require a rather more radical revision than that? We sent our Jeremy to find out.
In 1934, things were bad. 7,000 people were killed on the roads, even though there were only 1.5 million cars. In 1935, the driving test was introduced, and the death rate immediately fell by 1,000. Today, with 22 million cars on the roads, around about 5,000 are killed annually, but there's still room for improvement. Safer cars and better roads have helped, but there are now voices calling for improved driver training, especially as today's driving test is not exactly dissimilar to the test of 35. The only major changes coming next week involve the introduction of a reverse parking manoeuvre, hardly a giant leap forward for mankind. You still read a number plate at 20 metres and then drive for around about 20 minutes, hopefully showing the instructor you're not incompetent. And then you'll be asked questions on the highway code. Pass this lot and you're technically qualified, but are you competent? And even if you are, you can easily forget the basics. Do you know what the stopping distance is from 70 miles an hour on a dry road?
25 yards?
No, 90.
90?
Yeah, 315 feet.
Oh, 200 feet? I don't know.
Not quite 315.
No. 400 feet.
Well, you're a nice, safe driver. Could you define the 3 lanes on a motorway? Do you know what they're all for?
For slow traffic on the left, it's an overtaking on the third one.
Outside lane is passing lane. The middle lane will be middle lane, and the inside lane, I don't know.
A report, soon to be published, shows that nearly 1/5 of newly qualified drivers have an accident in their first year. A significant number have 2 or more.
Well, there's 1 or 2 things that we're unhappy about. Eyesight testing, for instance. I believe that there should be a better test of eyesight. I'm concerned also that it isn't a particularly good test. It isn't necessarily a preparation for driving on our modern roads. I'm thinking of motorway driving and night driving, and very often a person that passes their test knows very little about the motor car itself, and perhaps there is a case for some theoretical tests to make sure that they have some idea about driving, they have some idea about the vehicle, they're at least capable of preparing it properly to drive on our roads.
If there was a much wider syllabus from which the test was taken, then people would have to learn all of it and could be tested on part of it. The current driving test doesn't really give the examiner enough time to assess whether a person is up to the required standard. The test needs to be longer and include more manoeuvres. The introduction of the reverse parking exercise from the 1st of April is a step forwards.
The problem is that the newly formed Driving Standards Agency is reasonably satisfied with the current state of play, and changes must come from them.
I don't think it is out of date. He has demonstrated on the driving test that he's able to drive safely and conscientiously. And it's generally the case, I think, that most people having passed the test are well able to cope with conditions which they're likely to meet, very often as well as any experienced driver. It would not be practical to be able to test on every variety of road and weather conditions, no matter how long the test lasted. You couldn't test on everything.
Other countries are constantly updating their tests. In Florida, candidates must answer 20 questions before they're even allowed to take a test. And no fumbling around reading number plates either. They have a far more sophisticated eye test and fail twice as many as we do because they can't see properly. Interestingly, they've already dropped the parking manoeuvre that we're about to introduce in favour of a far more elaborate test. I think he's failing. Norway is acknowledged to have one of the hardest tests. They have 50 questions to answer in examination conditions on driving, the highway code, and even how a car works. And this part is completely separate from the actual driving test. And there's no wallying about on a housing estate either. You must take 4 lessons at night and in bad weather before the test. And even if you pass it, you must do more training in all sorts of conditions over the following 2 years. There's even more theory testing. Maybe we should be doing the same.
Certainly we are looking at the theory element of the test, and we will be looking to improve and broaden what we ask in that test. The actual, whether it will be written or otherwise, is still open for debate, and we are actually, within the next 2 months, going out on a consultation exercise when we'll be asking all interested parties their views on how that should be taken forward.
They have a scheme in Germany whereby a candidate who fails the test 3 times must take a medical if they want to try again. If they pass that, they're only allowed 1 more attempt at the test, and if they fail again, they must face a life on the bus. Draconian for sure, but it ought to make the roads safer.
I know, and I've experienced drivers who really should not be allowed behind the wheel of a car. Perhaps on one day they've managed to get their standards up sufficiently to satisfy an examiner. But there are people who are not really capable mentally in many respects and not capable physically of driving a car in today's conditions.
In various African countries, all you have to do to pass a driving test is go backwards 6 feet and forwards 6 feet. Ha ha ha. Well, that's probably about as funny as the Germans find our driving test. Surely it's about time we had a radical overhaul instead of just tinkering around with it. I wonder also if it might be about time we started treating the driving licence as a privilege and not as a right.
Jeremy,